du réseau africain pour la justice fiscale, en fait. Il est le coordonnateur. Monsieur Mosioma est aussi un intellectuel et aussi un chercheur dans la matière du développement économique en Afrique. Il s'est très tôt intéressé à la question des taxes sur les transactions financières parce qu'il dit que ce n'est pas qu'un enjeu nord-sud, ça touche toutes les populations et c'est ce qui m'a intéressé beaucoup. Et quand je lui ai demandé mais comment vous êtes venu aussi être militant, non pas seulement chercheur, c'est une personne qui s'est beaucoup impliquée dans les forums sociaux mondiaux et c'est au forum de Bamako, si je ne me trompe pas, en 2005, qui a eu ces discussions-là pour bâtir le réseau africain sur la justice fiscale. Donc, on est très contents ici de l'avoir avec nous. Monsieur Mosioma, je vous laisse la parole.
Bonjour. Unfortunately, that is the beginning and the end of my French. Listening to John speak, John has inspired many of us in Africa to take our position. Letting me speak after John, I think, is unfair because he said it all. Nevertheless, many times when we engage civil society organizations in Africa and they ask us, why should civil society organizations be working on tax? And my answer is very simple, and I hope this joke is going to be translatable in French. Tax is one of the two words in English that elicit a lot of emotions. Three-letter word with an X in it. And what the other one is, I'll leave it to the imagination. When we look at around the issue of tax, the existing development philosophy argues that African countries or poor countries of the South are too poor to save, and because they are too poor to save, they cannot build the capital base that is necessary for them to invest and spur economic growth. But this cannot be further from the reality. If we look at the figures out there, studies as have been presented here by John shows that the amount of money that is flowing out of Africa as a result of the illicit financial flows compared to the amount of money that is coming in. Actually, there was a survey that was carried out by an American institution looking at issues of aid, and citizens were asked, how much do you think of the American GDP are we giving out in terms of aid? The result was that they believed, the people that were questioned believed that the US spends about 10 to 15% of its income to support aid. That is what the US citizens believe. We tried a similar survey in Africa and asked students, how much do you think is funded by external sources? The results were equally surprising because most students that were asked believed that 70 to 80% of our budgets were funded by external resources. But this is the reality. The reality is that already now, much of Africa's development is funded by tax. There are, of course, a few countries in Africa which are still highly dependent on aid, but we are seeing an increase of African countries' reliance on domestic resources. However, if you look at studies and surveys that have been carried out by the World Bank and other international institutions, they indicate that for Africa to achieve, for developing countries to achieve MDGs, they will require a total of about 189 billion, which for low-income countries comes to about 105 billion by 2015. This translates to about 50 to 75 billion annually. So the big question is, where should this money come from? A survey that was recently carried out by the African Union indicates that many African countries are not going to achieve MDGs by 2015. And the core reason for this is that there's a huge, very significant financing gap. What it literally means is that more kids are going to die before the age of 5. Education is going to be still under. We're not going to be able to build sufficient and enough schools to provide quality education. But you look on the other side of the coin, is that while at the same time we are talking of this huge, significant resource gap, between 1970 and 2008, $854 billion flew out of Africa. These are according to a study that was carried out by GFI. Voici, the study that John presented here, estimates around the same figure of 124 billion by 2004, between 2017 and 2008. This translates to about $50 billion annually flowing out of African countries. So while we focus on the need to increase aid to Africa, we ignore the elephant in the room, which is that the existing global financial architecture has created structures that are facilitating resource outflow from poor countries to the north. Actually, a quote I like to say, this center is dark continent, is not Africa. The dark continent is in Europe. Europe is the dark continent in terms of financial transparency. It's providing the habits for money that is either looted or stolen from Africa by the wealthy and the rich elites. This is a similar study that was done by Christianity. Look at that graph and compare the amount of concentration that we give to aid. I'm not saying aid is not important, it's very important, it kind of saves life. But in terms of focus, how much time we focus on needs to increase aid, and how much time we're giving to looking at issues of these financial flows. Equally, if you look at annually, the Transparency International brings out what they call the Corruption Perception Index, which captures the most perceived, most corrupt countries. And many a times, many of these countries are African countries. You find Nigeria featuring number 1. Kenya, where I come from, is usually number 8, number 9. And at the bottom list of those countries are countries like Switzerland, which are perceived to be the least corrupt countries. And people do not see the contradiction. That how can countries that are perceived to be least corrupt be the ones that are providing the giving of the loot of the monies that are stolen from Africa? What kind of perception of corruption is that? This, let me give an example. These are the Zambian government 3 years ago commissioned a study to look at the operations of mining companies, a particular company called Mopani, which is 10% owned by the Zambian government. And they discovered serious inconsistencies in its financial books. One was that this company was reporting losses over a period of 10 years. any economic class 101 tells you that a company that operates for that a long period of time without reporting a single coin in profits would close up. But Mopani keeps on going on and on and on. These are some of the recommendations of the results of that analysis that was done. But interestingly, you look at the structure of Mopani, it explains why the company keeps on recording losses. Bigger part of Mopani's subsidiaries are in tax havens. Glencore is in Bermuda, Calisa Investment is in Virgin Islands, there's Glencore International is in Switzerland. What these companies do in those tax havens, it's themselves and God who knows. Because the current international financial reporting standard does not make a requirement for these countries to reveal what exactly they're doing. So what happens is that it is possible for companies to shift profits from high tax jurisdictions using manipulative accounting to shift profits from the jurisdictions where the actual economic activity took place to tax havens where they are not charged any zero tax or minimum tax. This is a quote from a study that was done by ActionAid, equally looking at Submiller. Submiller is a beer producing company and has got subsidiaries in Ghana, in Tanzania, in South Africa. And what was found out that this company was equally manipulating its accounts to shift profits. In Ghana, the company did not pay any single tax to the federal authority for a period of 4 years. They had a brand called Chibuku. Chibuku is a Zambian name for books, come from book. And earlier, cheap beer was packaged in Tetra packs. That's how the name Chibuku came about. Samila branded is named Chibuku, and the owner of that brand is a subsidiary registered in the Netherlands. Netherlands charges very low royalty taxes on royalties. So, the Zambian Samila would buy royalties right to use Chibuku for its beer from its subsidiary owned in the Netherlands, and therefore laundering or shifting the profits from Zambia to the Netherlands. When this company was asked, they said, we did everything according to the books. There's nothing illegal that we have done. The differentiation between tax avoidance and tax evasion is one of those areas that companies, when they are faced with these kinds of accusations, give. One famous quote that I saw a few days ago was the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance is the thickness of the prison wall. A study that was done by TGN examining the use of tax evasion found out that 99% of UK quoted companies, 97% of those largest quoted companies in the UK, and the 3 of the largest US quoted companies operated to subsidiaries in tax havens. The big question is why? What is it that a company can't do in Canada, it can do in Bermuda? It's a big question. Efforts by governments to address the problem of low tax rates are often undermined by vested interests of companies and sometimes governments. There was a commission that was set up by the Tanzanian government to analyze and make recommendations on how Tanzania should deal with its mining sector, and came up with recommendations that there was need for Tanzania as a government to increase the tax rates. But when that debate came into Parliament, the Canadian government sent a very strong delegation to Tanzania to strongly lobby leading the districtors in the ruling party of Families among and the opposition to ensure, this is a quote that was in the press, to ensure that this bill does not go through. So the question is, whose interest was the Canadian government in this particular case? In summary, it is the existence of tax savings have led to the bleeding of African resources, revenues. They have accumulated inequality by concentrating wealth on the top, the world movement around Occupy states around the world. It has forced governments to borrow both locally and domestically, and creating an intergenerational inequality. And lastly, it has limited the policy space, because as governments become more and more dependent on resources that come from outside, they are not able to develop their own domestic priorities. Much of the aid that comes into Africa, of course, as you are aware, comes tied. And as policy recommendations are not going to in that post-John nation, we feel that there is need to increase the transparency of how multinational companies report their profits. And this cannot be done by ensuring that they report their profits on a country-by-country basis. Secondly, there is need to support efforts for an international tax collaboration. Tax is often discussed in the conference of national policy, but the reality is that what Canada does as a tax policy has an implication on what happens in Tanzania and what happens in Kenya. Why? Because the regulations that Canada puts on its companies determines how Canadian companies behave when they operate in Canada. There is need to ensure that revenue authorities can be able to access the information they need to ascertain if the balance, the fact that the financial statements that have been provided to them are true. Lastly, I would like to finish with this quote by the former Finance Minister Trevor Mano of South Africa, where he said that it's a huge contradiction to support the increase of development assistance and yet turn a blind eye to actions by multinational companies and others to undermine the tax basis of our developing countries. I thank you very much for listening.
Chamboulian, je suis conseiller à la CSQ, qui est une des organisations membres de l'échec aux paradis fiscaux, qui essaie d'attirer l'attention sur la question des paradis fiscaux. J'ai eu la chance d'assister les 2 dernières journées à Ottawa. Ah, d'accord, c'est vrai, on n'a pas oublié les traducteurs. J'ai eu la chance d'assister les 2 dernières journées à Ottawa, au forum, au sommet pour une fiscalité équitable organisé par les Canadiens. Et j'aimerais reposer à M. Christensen une question que Dennis lui a posée, que je trouvais fort appropriée. Et la question c'était la suivante: qu'est-ce que nous devrions réclamer des gouvernements, notamment du gouvernement fédéral? Que devrions-nous lui réclamer comme mesure à prendre, des choses à faire pour s'attaquer à la question des paradis fiscaux? J'aimerais ça que les gens dans la salle ici bénéficient de la réponse que vous avez donnée hier à cette question.
Now to inform ourselves about this subject. The subject is clearly enormous. It takes you to the heart of why globalization has failed to deliver. So I think we must all read, find out what literature is available. Alain has written on this, Nick Jackson's book is available. Find out about it. But we all need to build up a global campaign for pressure upon our governments to take action. The 2 or 3 key demands I think you can move forward on reflect the fact that Canada, first of all, is a member of the G20. And the G20 is responsible for the design of what we call the global financial architecture. And I suggest to you that global financial architecture needs complete and radical redesign. Our governments need to go back to the drawing boards and prepare a new financial architecture built around transparency, better governance, better international cooperation. What should we be asking the Canadian government to do in this context? Well, first of all, I think that we need to know how much is Canada losing as Canada itself, losing as a result of tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax exemptions given to companies, the huge costs. Giving exemptions carries a massive cost. And we call them tax expenditures, because they cost a great deal of public money. We need to find out how much Canada is losing. Our own estimate for the United Kingdom government, as you heard earlier, was £125 billion every single year, which is much, much, much more than the austerity cuts that the government has now imposed, which will devastate our national health service, devastate the pension systems, devastate the education systems. Our roads in Britain are crumbling, falling apart. Our infrastructure is not fit for purpose. Research and development is at an all-time low because of these government cuts. If this sounds familiar, it's because Britain, Canada, and most of the Anglo-American economies are following the same stupid economic programs. It's not. So let's find out how much it's costing you, how much money you're losing to this. Secondly, I think given the scale of Canadian activities overseas, above all in the mining sectors, it's imperative that we move forward with adopting the country-by-country financial reporting standards that Alvin referred to just now. Canadian mining companies operate in most countries in Africa and Latin America. And I know from my own investigations, it's almost impossible to get any useful financial information about what they're doing, because they hide behind tax haven subsidiaries to such a large extent. So pushing for an international financial reporting standard or country-to-country reporting is a useful step forward. The Americans have already partially adopted one into law through the Dodd-Frank bill. They have project-by-country, project-by-project reporting requirements built into that bill, applying to all companies registered on American exchanges, and that comes into force from 2013 for next year onwards. And the third area, again, Alvin mentioned that just now in this list of recommendations, is to move towards automatic information exchange between countries as an alternative to the pathetic standard of the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development. And let me tell you why it's so pathetic. It was built upon this idea that if, by some miracle, the tax authorities in, let's say, Kenya, find out that a senior Kenyan politician, or wealth holder, or businessman has opened a bank account in Switzerland, if by some miracle they find they have that smoking gun, they can then prepare a detailed dossier to present to the courts in the Swiss canton, wherever that bank account is, saying, this citizen has this account at this branch of this bank, here's our evidence for this, now we'll incorporate and confirm it. Well, you don't need to be brilliant to recognize the deficiencies of this remarkable approach to information exchange. And it's clear also now, with a clear pattern, that courts in the tax havens are proving very resistant. The French Finance Minister earlier this year said that only 30% of their requests for information have been reciprocated. So even if you prepare a dossier and present it with, by some remarkable circumstance, you have that smoking gun, even if you prepare a dossier, it is not certain that it will receive the cooperation under existing treaty arrangements. So I think we need to move on, we need to move towards that information exchange. We need to move to an era of international cooperation and transparency. And I think those are the three key things where you can push your government to take action.
En matière de revenu national pour l'AMPD, pour le président officiel et le vice-président du comité des finances à la Chambre des communes. Donc, pour vous informer, nous, on vient d'attendre une motion jeudi dernier au comité des finances pour justement étudier tout ce qui est évasion fiscale et paradis fiscaux. Il y avait une étude qui a été faite avant par la Chambre à cause des élections. On a dû mettre ça de côté. J'ai demandé au mois de juin de réétudier ça et les conservateurs n'ont pas voulu. Et mardi, on va avoir une réponse. Mais j'ai aussi le privilège de rencontrer M. Christensen et M. Howlett. Malheureusement, je n'ai pas pu assister au aux 2 jours, parce qu'il y avait une petite affaire qui était déposée, qui était le budget. Je voulais avoir l'occasion de rencontrer M. Christensen dans mon bureau. Je voulais savoir, puis premièrement, merci beaucoup, vos présentations sont extraordinaires. C'est vraiment beaucoup de choses à apprendre, mais aussi je pense que c'est bien parce qu'on voit une motivation, on voit que les gens commencent à en parler. Je voulais savoir, est-ce que vous avez un exemple peut-être d'un pays ou d'une juridiction qui justement s'attaque aux paradis fiscaux, qui ont trouvé des solutions et sur lesquelles on peut se baser comme exemple?
The truth of the matter is, at the moment, we're seeing a vicious cycle, a race to the bottom, not just in tax rates, but also in legislative and regulatory arrangements. This tax haven phenomenon is corrosive. It is corroding the international law. It's corroding democracy. And there are very, very few countries that are really can be held up as examples of good practice. I would point to the European Union, which has been trying to tackle this for so many years, despite the fact that some of the world's biggest tax havens are right at the heart of the European Union. Luxembourg, for example, United Kingdom, Ireland, Netherlands, Austria, all European Union members, and of course they carry the dependent territories like Monaco and Jersey and the Isle of Man, all those British crown overseas territories in the Caribbean region. You look at half of the identified tax havens around the world, and they all have the Queen's head on their stamps. So there's a particular problem with Britain. But the European Union has been trying to move forward, first of all, with automatic information exchange. That is their mechanism for cooperation within the European Union. At the moment, it's a weak mechanism because when it was introduced, after fanatical lobbying against it by the British government, by the Luxembourg government, by the Austrian government, by the Swiss government, even though they're not member of the European Union, they didn't include what are called legal persons. They only covered natural persons under the savings tax directive. Natural persons being you and me. A legal person being a company or a trust or a foundation or some similar kind of legal entity. And the problem with that, of course, is that any sophisticated tax evader doesn't use their own name. They do that. They set up very elaborate offshore structures, typically involving trusts, foundations, which own offshore companies, which own other offshore companies, which own other offshore companies, blah, 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 blah. When I was working inside the tax evasion industry at Deloitte Touche, typically we try to set up at least 4 or 5 different structures in 4 or 5 different jurisdictions, precisely to create obstruction to investigation. So it's important that we ensure that any information exchange also covers legal entities. All types of legal entities. But the European Union has moved forward on that project. The European Union is also trying to move forward with an anti-tax competition project, the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base that I mentioned earlier on, which is an attempt not to create common tax rates across the Union, but to create a common tax base across the Union. And that's the first step towards creating the facility for taxing companies as a unit, and then apportioning the tax across the different countries where the actual economic activity takes place. In other words, the so-called unitary taxation based upon formula apportionment. So the European Union has been pushing forward here. And there are some countries which I think hold up better practice than others. The Scandinavians, not unexpectedly, are good practitioners, or generally good practitioners in this area. But the truth of the matter is, this is a gigantic mess, a global mess, and the only solutions, by and large, solutions lie with international cooperation. There are some measures that countries can take at a national level, but the majority of measures require international cooperation. And that's where we run up against the political problem, because the OECD claims to be a legitimate organisation to work in this area, even though it's only 34 countries. And they have consistently, and for decades, blocked the United Nations Tax Committee from moving forward with a very different agenda. And to give you some idea of how current that is, in New York just 3 weeks ago, the OECD countries yet again blocked a UN proposal backed by all developing countries, pushed by China and India, South Africa and Brazil. It's a powerful BRIC economies, all pushing for the upgrade of this tax committee to political status, and it's the OECD countries that block it, precisely because they are trying to prevent progress in this area. So it might not be the answer you were hoping for, but it's the best I can give.
If I might add just one point, I think in this bleak situation, there is a fairly recent sign of hope in precisely China and India and South Africa and Brazil beginning to take a much more active position in pushing for tackling this problem within the G20, but also pushing for the locus of the discussion being moved to the United Nations. And as we see globally a shift away from the old capitalist countries, the US, Europe, Japan, and Canada, and so on, to the emerging countries, we are seeing a shift in power. And I think as they become much more active in pushing for this, we're going to have some powerful allies to actually move this forward. But I think it's going to have to be in the UN fora. And it will, the UN is usually, when they get to a final conclusion, it's a very good conclusion. The problem with the UN process is it often takes a lot of time. But I think we have much more hope working through that process. And I think a key thing will be to push Canada to really shift their support to tackling this issue within the UN fora. That would be another demand we make of the Canadian government. We may not get too far with the current federal government, but hopefully the next Canadian government, and especially if Wang Mai is the revenue minister or the finance minister, we could get much further down.
Député Christophe Loutou-Moulin a présidé une commission pour comprendre ce qu'il en était des contrats miniers signés entre le Congo, qui avait été en guerre en 1996 et 2003, et des compagnies minières étrangères, majoritairement canadiennes, j'en nommerai pas. Il s'est rendu compte que beaucoup de contrats avaient été signés en fait par des grandes entreprises via leurs filiales offshore, via les paradis fiscaux, de sorte que le Parlement congolais, voulant savoir avec qui des belligérants dans le cadre d'une guerre qui a fait 5 millions de morts, avait signé des contrats, ne pouvait pas formellement le savoir. On ne savait même pas avec qui on avait négocié. Donc c'est un cas que je connais. Je voulais savoir, d'après vos recherches, dans quelle mesure, et selon tous les secteurs d'activité, pas seulement minier, mais l'agroalimentaire, les travaux publics, ainsi de suite, dans quelle mesure c'est courant que des grandes entreprises signent des contrats avec des chefs d'État africains, des administrations africaines, en passant par des filiales dans les paradis fiscaux.
Moi, ma question s'adresse à M. Alvin Mosioma. J'ai beaucoup aimé sa présentation et puis je suis très content de voir qu'il y a une activité il y a un organisme comme le sien qui sensibilise la population africaine sur ces enjeux. En fait, la question que je voulais vous poser, vous appelez à la transparence et notamment à la coopération entre les pays pour lever le voile sur cette question finalement des paradis fiscaux. Toutefois, vous avez montré à travers vos exemples que ce sont beaucoup de compagnies minières qui sont impliquées dans ce genre de transactions. La question est la suivante, pour des pays comme le vôtre, où vous avez cité la Tanzanie, vous avez cité la Zambie, est-ce que précisément ça ne pose pas également la question qui est de savoir est-ce que le développement de ces pays passe essentiellement par l'industrie extractive, ou bien est-ce que justement ce qui vient d'être soulevé par tous ces partenaires de substitution, et sauf dans des pays comme le Kenya, qui ont des marges de manœuvre très réduites dans leurs échanges avec leurs partenaires traditionnels, est-ce que l'émergence de partenaires de substitution qui sont justement dans la conjoncture actuelle, une mutation géopolitique à travers l'émergence de pays comme l'Inde, comme le Brésil, vous avez, est-ce que ça ne donne pas justement des leviers complémentaires qui peuvent être investis pour développer des secteurs d'activité, pour sortir justement de la logique des médias extractifs? Est-ce que vous faites ce type de réflexion en lien justement avec la question du réseau?
on the question of the use of offshore, it is a very prevalent problem, although I must admit that there are very few researches that have been done in terms of how many of these multinational companies are actually using that. What we have seen is, even in the case not only of extractives, but other sectors, is what John mentioned earlier of round tripping, where you have not only multinational companies, but even local wealthy individuals going offshore, registering companies there, and then coming in as foreign investors using particularly the Mauritius. Actually, there is an annual Mauritius show in Kenya, and they openly market those kinds of tools as avenues for investment. So I think that the big problem is that there is at the policy level very little awareness among policymakers on the impact of this kind of structures to the revenue basis of these countries. There has been, in few countries in Africa, attempts to investigate the operations of these kind of companies that are operating from offshore. And of course, as mentioned by John earlier, you hit a wall, because for you to be able to have this information, number one, you must have a ban from double taxation agreement. Secondly, you must provide credible evidence that whatever investigations you're carrying out, they are justified. And of course, that is like, it piques the sense in the first place, because the reason you want to have this information is to have the evidence. So they are asking you to provide evidence that there's tax evasion, but that's actually what you're trying to find out. So I think that's why we feel that the need for collaboration and automatic exchange of information is very important. Also, you must also take into consideration that many revenue authorities in developing countries, and particularly in Africa, lack sufficient capacity. In many countries where we have been, remember cases in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, where you have 30 people administering the operations of over 200 companies, so-called large taxpayers. It's basically impractical to be able to start tracking down one specific company and try to go to Mauritius, and then move to Jersey, and move to Cayman Island, to try to track all the places that they are needed there. They are trying to hide the profit. So it's a serious problem, and I think that it's not a problem that can be resolved at national level. It needs international cooperation as the only solution we see here, through automatic exchange of information. That information is put there and made really accessible for everybody. The issues of extracting, of course, is a very broad issue. It's very difficult. Of course, we see what we call the Dutch disease, where once companies or countries discover minerals or oil, the whole economy shifts in terms of the source of financing, in terms of everything is now financed through that single resource, and of course that creates a lot of problems, including the accountability mechanisms towards the citizens, because the government is funding resources made from oil or from diamonds, doesn't feel that it is answerable to those citizens. But on the other side, it's very difficult to convince any country, particularly when you look at the kind of challenges of poverty they are dealing with, to tell them to diversify. It is something that we have been calling in our previous discussions with the government, that it's important to sort of not concentrate on one single source, but it's a challenge that affects cuts across many African countries. What is happening is that at the African Union level, there are processes to try and see are there best practice examples. Can we borrow, for instance, from the Norwegian model, where all these resources are there, really have been exploited is a sustainable way that you can still finance the economy, but also in the manner that is happening. Thank you.
Ce problème politique, il y a toute la question technique et des experts et professionnels à tout niveau qui conseillent les gouvernements et qui conseillent les entreprises. Je me demandais est-ce que les organisations internationales, associations comptables, avocats, économistes, fiscalistes, qui sont sensibilisés à cette question et qui travaillent activement sur la question normative, sur la question des principes éthiques, qui devraient accompagner ces professionnels.
La deuxième intervention.
Oui, vous m'entendez bien? Je viens d'avoir une nouvelle qui est sortie il y a 3 heures à peu près et qui est en lien avec les questions qui sont posées avec le sujet. Monsieur Maille avait posé une question, le député Maille avait posé une question sur les pays qui luttaient le plus contre les paradis fiscaux. Et cette lutte passe aussi, lutter contre les paradis fiscaux, c'est aussi lutter contre le secret bancaire. Et il y a à peu près 4 heures, la Suisse a lancé des mandats d'arrêt contre 3 inspecteurs allemands parce que ce serait eux qui auraient vendu des CD révélant des fraudeurs allemands. Et là, on voit une situation absurde, c'est que ce sont... Et à la question, et vous aviez répondu, l'Union européenne luttait beaucoup contre les paradis fiscaux, et là, on a une action de l'Allemagne qui lutte. Et la situation absurde, c'est que là, ici, il y a une inversion. Les criminels, ce sont ceux qui luttent contre les paradis fiscaux. Et la présidente de la province d'Allemagne, on dit un Land, de Rhénanie du Nord-Westphalie, a dit, ça c'est les mots, c'est monstrueux, et elle défend les 3 inspecteurs allemands du fisc, elle les défend, et elle trouve ça absurde elle aussi. Donc, et là, ça m'amène à ma question, quel est le rôle de l'Allemagne, qui est un pays puissant mondialement, dans la lutte contre les paradis fiscaux?
Answer the first question a little bit. There is efforts to help increase the capacity of developing countries in terms of tax policies. One example is Neil Brooks, who is one of the authorities on tax law. He's the head of tax law at Osgood Law School in Toronto. He's also a board member of Canadians for Tax Fairness. He has just recently returned from visits to a number of African countries where he has been a consultant helping those governments develop much more effective tax policies to be able to capture a fair share of returns. So there are efforts, and in fact, the Canadian government has even funded some projects to try to increase the capacity for resource collection within developing countries. So there is a bit of that happening, but much more needs to happen. There is support from the United Nations in particular on this front. And there has been some improvements, and it is encouraging, and perhaps you could say a little bit more, Alvin, about this. The African Union actually has recently taken an initiative to try to address the question of resource, raising revenue, more revenue from internal sources. So there are some encouraging signs, but much more needs to be done, and we need to support that.
Yeah, that's very true. On the positive side, we have seen African governments sort of move towards building themselves, building their own capacity. Recently, there was a forum that was established by the African tax authorities called ATTAC, which stands for the African Tax Administrators Forum, which brings together revenue authorities from across Africa to share experience and learn from each other and share information in terms of how to deal with the different challenges they face. Secondly, as has been mentioned, there has been an establishment of an expert panel, a panel of experts, to specifically focus on illicit financial flows led by the former head of state of Southern Africa, Thabo Mbeki. While there is positive development, I must, however, underline that these efforts are sort of being frustrated again by organizations like OECD because of the very vested interest that John was mentioning. Like the OECD has, we are seeing them taking a more increased control of the Africa Tax Administrators Forum. So when you talk of them facilitating capacity building, it's a question of not just capacity, but it's capacity to do what. And we have seen prevalence that was in Ghana recently, and the Ghana Revenue Authority was being supported by an expert team from OECD to implement transfer pricing regulations according to the OECD model of housing principle. So while it's important to advocate for the need of increased capacity of revenue authorities, the question of what kind of capacities are we looking for? There was a similar case of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has been negotiating with the governments of Kenya and Uganda to implement double taxation agreements, and while an official of the Dutch Finance Ministry came to our office to try and tell us how much supported they are. My question that I asked him was, so what is happening now? He says that we are in the process of signing double taxation agreements, and that once we have signed them, we will then provide capacity to implement those double taxation agreements. So it beats logic, because a double taxation agreement is a negotiation. So how do you negotiate with a country to sign a double taxation agreement before they have that capacity to negotiate and understand what they're signing? So you're putting the cart in front of the horse. And this is something that we're seeing prevalent, and we're very concerned about this kind of capacity building measures that are maybe currently driven by the OECD and then by natural institutions, including BFID and others.
I want to echo and maybe amplify what Alvin has been saying. You might have got the impression from what I said earlier on that I'm a little bit skeptical about the OECD. I won't go deeper. I can say I'm actively hostile towards the OECD. I've been a member of their tax and development task force for the last 3 years. And all I can say is this has been a shocking exercise in duplicity. What they want to do is to promote value-added tax and other progressive tax systems across Africa. That's their plan. And when they talk about capacity raising in Africa, they're by and large talking about raising the capacity to enforce regressive taxation mixes. This is not what we should be supporting at all. This is tax injustice, not tax justice. So let's be clear, the OECD project is an unjust project. And the real problem with many African countries is not so much that they lack capacity to collect their taxes, but that they do not have the appropriate tax mix policies to begin with. They have had foisted upon them, often by the International Monetary Fund and other organizations, a tax policy mix which is by and large regressive and which is stifling growth. And that's precisely what the OECD is trying to do, trying to achieve, because they want to have OECD companies investing at very low rates of tax. They do not want to have progressive direct taxation. They are by and large pushing regressive indirect taxation. And therefore I think we need to be very cautious when our own countries, OECD countries like Britain, start saying we're trying to help develop tax capacity in Africa. This is our contribution towards strengthening their domestic resource mobilization programs, because by and large they're actually promoting anti-poor tax programs. But I want to address this issue of Switzerland, because I have a particular concern about Switzerland. The question was, the question quite rightly pointed to this very extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, where the people who are trying to tackle Swiss banking secrecy are themselves being criminalized. And this again shows a weakness in the international political dynamic momentum to tackle this. Because the G20 wanted to move forward in strengthening information exchange systems. And the last thing the Swiss government is going to adopt is automatic information exchange, because that would devastate their banks, because their banks are by and large built around the model of what when you go flying, you'll see all these advertisements for UBS and others promoting private client wealth management. That's code for tax evasion. We help you evade taxes. And UBS is a criminal organisation. For those of you, I can say that with impunity because UBS has been investigated by the US and has been indicted and has been fined and almost lost its banking license for helping US citizens to evade tax, and also because a whistleblower walked up UBS in Zurich with 3 CDs and gave them to me personally, giving absolute evidence of UBS's complicity in criminal activity. So UBS is not a normal bank, it's a criminal bank. But the Swiss authorities, the Swiss government's position is quite clear. They are going to do everything possible to resist the automatic information exchange process within the European Union. They have been orchestrating and defending their position on banking secrecy. If the OECD thinks that banking secrecy is a thing of the past, a dream on banking secrecy remains as virile as ever, precisely because the Swiss will not move in this area. And so what did they do? They came forward to Germany and Britain, and more recently France and Greece, and said, we will promote a new agreement where we will actually raise the tax on your behalf. We know you have all your citizens, wealthy citizens using Swiss banks, so leave it to us. We'll collect the tax on your behalf. We won't identify who these people are. But we through it's true, Dennis, it's true. You couldn't make this up. The so-called Rubik agreements, which is their solution to tackling criminality, we will collect the tax on your behalf and we'll send you the money. And the sums they talked about, in the case of the United Kingdom, they said, we'll raise £7 billion for you. The UK government, our Chancellor, is probably the worst I've ever seen in my lifetime, said, oh yeah, I'll go for the money quickly, and signed up last week. Now, yeah, it's true. Check it out. Now, the problem with this agreement is, first of all, the sums involved are massively exaggerated because we organised a competition amongst our lawyers, who are amongst the best in the world in this area, to see who could come up with as many loopholes as possible within 24 hours. The prize winner had 15 loopholes. And if you want to check out the loopholes, we put them up on our blog. We provide them to the Swiss government, the German government, the UK government, and said, okay, here are our loopholes in this agreement. This is how we can help our clients, your clients rather, to evade this agreement. Prove us wrong. That was in October last year, and we're still waiting to hear from them. Because the agreements they signed are riddled with loopholes precisely because the German elites and the UK elites who use Switzerland and have used Switzerland for decades are determined to block international efforts to tackle tax evasion. It's precisely because they hold power that they can do this. We are facing a massive power struggle. Do not trust our politicians in the current Conservative governments to take effective action, because it's the elites that fund their parties and themselves who use these structures. And just in case you doubt me, I made a program to look at a documentary broadcast in Britain on the offshore structures used by the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, and his family use of offshore structures in the Cayman Islands. These people have no interest in taking measures against this. The Swiss, we hold the Swiss, they came up top of our financial secrecy index ranking. They are probably the most powerful and prominent secrecy jurisdiction in the world, and they're very, very clever about protecting their interests because they always strike just at the moment when they know that governments like the United Kingdom or France or Greece need some money up front. And they say, hey, we can collect all this money, $7 billion. And our Chancellor's eyes went round and round. And they thought, yeah, I'll go for that, rather than tackle the problem systemically.